Snow sifted across the open plain like ash from a dying world, carried by the restless wind that whistled through naked cottonwoods and rattled against the high glass windows of the Greyhawk Ranch. Inside, the fire burned with a stubborn glow, its warmth holding back the vast cold pressing at the walls. Chenoa Greyhawk, widow at 23, moved about the great room in silence, her hands restless though her body ached from the weight of solitude. She poured another measure of coffee she would not finish, stirred soup that had long since gone cold, and paused often to stare at the door as though waiting for footsteps that would never return. The house was too big for one soul. Built by her late husband in pride and in haste, every corner carried his presence. The carved banisters, the rugs dragged in from distant merchants, the heavy furniture meant to show the town his success. But he had died too young, thrown from a horse during roundup, and left her the burden of both his wealth and his absence. In the year since, the mansion-like ranch had become more mausoleum than home. The townsfolk whispered. They always did. At church, she caught their eyes sliding toward her, lips bent in cruel half-smiles. Too rich for her age, she heard in one breath. Cursed, in another. They said she was untouched by grief, that her beauty remained too sharp, too proud for a woman left alone. That no man dared court her now, for what sort of woman had the Lord taken 1 year into marriage? Chenoa smiled politely when they spoke, but in the stillness of night the words gnawed like wolves at her ribs. That night the snow came heavier, thick and blinding. She drew the curtains, banked the fire, and tried to ignore the creaks of the beams above her. Yet some nights silence itself carried a sound, a thrum of loneliness that filled her chest until she feared she would break. She pressed her palms to her cheeks and whispered, "Enough." But the wind only laughed, as if the earth itself knew she had no voice strong enough to silence her pain. It was close to midnight when the knock came. A single thud, heavy against the wood. Then another, slow, deliberate. She froze at the hearth, her breath misting before her lips though the fire burned bright. For a long moment she did not move. Few dared ride in such weather. Fewer still would knock instead of barging in. The third knock was softer, not a demand but a plea. Her hand trembled as she lifted the iron latch. The door swung open to the storm, and in its frame stood a man unlike any she had ever seen. He was tall, giant, even, his shoulders broad as the doorway itself. His chest was bare despite the bitter cold, muscles still corded with strength, though his age showed in the long mane of white hair that streamed over them. Snow clung to him like frost upon a mountain stone. His face, weathered and lined, was striking in its severity, but his eyes carried no menace. They were dark, still, filled with a dignity that unsettled her more than any threat could have. He did not step in until she moved aside. He simply stood there, snow swirling about him, his breath steady as the fire's glow fell over him. At last he spoke, his voice low, gravel cut by something older than time. "Let me stay. I will work for you. I will guard your house. I will even give you children again if you wish." The words struck like stones against glass. Chenoa's lips parted, but no reply came. She had expected a thief, a beggar, even death disguised as a man. Not this strange and solemn offering from a stranger, who looked carved from the mountain itself. "Who are you?" she whispered. He bowed his head, white hair falling over his face. "Nantan. I have nothing. But my hands, my back, my breath. They are yours if you let me stay." Her mind spun. The town already scorned her. To harbor an Apache, an old one at that, would be to invite humiliation beyond bearing. Yet something in his tone, his calm defiance of the storm, kept her from slamming the door. She glanced past him at the swirling white night, at the endless dark fields her husband once ruled. To send him back into it seemed cruel, even sinful. "You can stay, for the night," she murmured, her voice uncertain, as though speaking to herself more than him. "But only the night." He nodded once, not grateful, not triumphant. Simply as though her words had been expected. He stepped inside, and the door shut behind him with a sound that echoed through the hollow house. By the fire, his presence filled the room. He did not sit until she gestured. He did not speak again. He only extended his hands to the flames, palms scarred, veins raised, the hands of a man who had labored long past when others had faltered. She watched him from across the hearth, her heart unsettled. There was no hunger in his gaze, no madness. Only stillness, and a strange kind of mourning she recognized as kin to her own. The silence between them deepened. At last she rose, fetched him a blanket, and placed it over his shoulders without a word. He inclined his head, but did not look at her. She returned to her chair, her body taut as a drawn bowstring. For the first time in months, the house felt less like a tomb. Yet she could not tell whether that comfort frightened her more than his sudden arrival. When she closed her eyes that night, she dreamt of whispers, women's voices thick with scorn, men's laughter sharp with mockery. But cutting through them came another sound, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood, strong and unending. She woke with her heart pounding, unsure if it was dream or omen. Downstairs, she heard him move, slow and careful, tending the fire. Snow hissed against the windows, the storm refusing to break. Chenoa pressed her hand to her chest, her breath uneven. She told herself it was only one night. By morning, he would be gone. Yet some part of her, small, stubborn and shameful, already feared what would happen if he wasn't. Morning came wrapped in silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. Chenoa stirred from uneasy sleep and descended the stairs to find Nantan outside, stripped to his waist despite the frost that glazed the world in white. His breath rose in clouds, his arms swung with unhurried strength, each stroke of the blade sending shards of pine scattering across the snow. She stood in the doorway, the cold biting at her face, torn between awe and disbelief. He had asked nothing of her, not food nor coin, only worked as though the land were his burden to shoulder. By midday the yard carried the scent of fresh-cut wood. Piles rose neat against the barn wall, higher than what her own hands could have gathered in a week. She brewed coffee, though her stomach resisted it, and carried a cup to him. His eyes, dark as river stone, lifted to meet hers. He took the cup without a word, but when their fingers brushed against the porcelain, a shiver not born of cold ran through her. She turned away too quickly, ashamed of the warmth that followed. That afternoon, the sheriff rode up the lane. Amos Cutter, broad in his saddle, heavy-jawed and sharp-eyed, dismounted with the kind of authority men wear like armor. Behind him trudged Delilah Crow, her shawl clutched tight, her eyes quick with curiosity. "Morning, Mrs. Greyhawk," Cutter said, his voice like gravel rolled in oil. His gaze slid past her shoulder to the giant by the woodpile. "That man belong to you?" "He asked for work," she replied, her tone carefully level. "I allowed him shelter. Only for the storm." Delilah sniffed. "An Apache, and old enough to be your father, roaming half-naked on your land? Lord save us, the town will talk." Chenoa stiffened, but Nantan continued stacking logs, unbothered by their presence, as though gossip could not pierce his skin. Cutter studied him, eyes narrowing, then turned back to Chenoa. "You do well to think of appearances," he warned. "Folks in town don't look kindly on arrangements like this." She swallowed her anger, dipped her head in polite dismissal. "Thank you, Sheriff. That will be all." But it was not all. By Sunday, the church hummed with whispers. Chenoa walked through the doors, her shawl drawn close, her chin held high, but she could feel the tide of eyes on her like nettles against bare skin. Children smirked, their mothers leaned together in sharp clusters. Men shook their heads with quiet disdain. And then the sound came, laughter, soft at first, then sharper, cutting into her like knives hidden behind him. She chose a pew near the front, refusing to bend, yet the shame pressed heavy upon her. When the preacher spoke of sin, she could feel the congregation's attention shift toward her, as though her presence alone summoned his words. When the service ended, she rose quickly, eager to escape, but found her path blocked by Delilah. "You're a young woman, Chenoa," she said, voice thick with false pity. "It's one thing to grieve, another to take up with, well that." Her eyes flicked to the doorway, where Nantan stood silent, waiting to escort Chenoa home. Heat surged to her cheeks, shame battling fury. She pushed past without reply, the icy air outside striking her face like a blessing. Nantan walked behind her, his step steady, his gaze fixed forward. The people parted for him, not with respect but with fear, their whispers swirling in the wake of their passing. Back at the ranch, she collapsed against the door, trembling. "They hate me now," she whispered, though whether to him or to herself she did not know. He placed the firewood down gently, the sound of it thudding against the floor. Then he stood there, silent as stone, watching her with eyes that revealed nothing yet seemed to understand everything. She wanted to scream, to drive him out, to prove to herself she was not what they said. But the words tangled on her tongue, strangled by the truth that in his presence the loneliness eased, even beneath the weight of scorn. The days that followed hardened the gossip into certainty. Jedediah Boone, her late husband's ranch hand, came to the house with anger blazing in his eyes. "This is shameful," he spat. "Your husband would never have allowed it. You disgrace his memory." His fists clenched, his body taut with the threat of violence. Before Chenoa could answer, Nantan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, nor his hand. He only stood, tall and unyielding, his gaze fixed on Boone until the younger man faltered. The silence between them was heavier than any blow, and Boone, muttering curses, retreated down the lane. After he left, Chenoa turned on Nantan, fury masking fear. "You cannot stay," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't you see what you're doing to me? They'll never forgive me for this." He bowed his head slightly, as if accepting judgment. But instead of leaving, he returned to his labor, mending the sagging barn door with careful precision. She watched from the window, her anger collapsing into something more fragile, more dangerous. A recognition that he did not fight her battles with words but with presence, with the quiet defiance of simply staying. That night, as snow fell soft against the windows, Chenoa lay awake listening to the sound of his movements below. The scrape of a chair, the crack of the fire. She thought of the eyes in church, the laughter, the pitying voices, and felt shame rise again. But when she pictured his hands splitting wood, his silent stance before Boone, something inside her shifted. It was not love, not yet, but a strange seed of loyalty, unasked for yet rooted deep. The storm outside thickened, muffling the world in silence. She rose from bed, stepped to the window, and looked down into the yard. There he was, again bare-chested in the cold, stacking the last of the wood by lantern light. His breath turned to mist, his movements slow but tireless. She pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. A whisper escaped her lips, so quiet she almost doubted it had been spoken. "Why are you really here?" At that moment, as if hearing the question carried on the wind, Nantan lifted his face. His eyes, dark and steady, met hers across the snowy yard. For an instant the distance between them seemed to vanish, the silence speaking louder than words. And then he turned back to his work, leaving her heart pounding with the certainty that he carried an answer she was not yet ready to hear. The days slid into one another, marked not by bells or clocks but by the steady rhythm of labor. Nantan rose with the dawn, wordless, already moving before the light reached the windows. Chenoa often woke to the sound of his axe splitting wood or the creak of the barn door being mended. He asked for nothing, not a coin nor a kind word, only worked as if the land itself had entrusted him with its wounds. The snow deepened, swallowing fences, frosting the roofline until the ranch looked carved from the very winter. Chenoa spent her mornings in the kitchen, her shawl drawn close, watching him through the frosted panes. He moved with a strange patience, never hurried, never careless. Even when the wind howled, driving needles of ice across the yard, he worked bare-chested, his breath clouding in the frigid air. She told herself it was pride, stubbornness, perhaps madness. But there was grace in it too, a dignity that unnerved her more than it comforted. Once, she found her shawl, torn weeks ago by a nail, mended and folded neatly by the hearth. Another morning, a basket of kindling sat by her chair, the wood trimmed fine enough to catch with a single spark. She knew it was his doing, though he never spoke of it. These offerings arrived without announcement, without expectation of thanks, and though she tried to ignore them, each one lodged itself like a splinter in her chest. The gossip in town thickened. On her rare trips to fetch flour or salt, she felt the stares sharpen. Delilah Crow's voice carried loud across the mercantile. "The widow keeps him like a guard dog. Or worse." Laughter followed, cruel and thin. Chenoa lifted her chin, paid for her goods and walked out without reply, but her cheeks burned hot under the winter air. She told herself she didn't care, but the shame followed her home like a shadow she could not shake. That evening, she found Jedediah Boone waiting at the gate. His hat brim low, his jaw tight, he looked every inch the man of her late husband's world, loyal to him and contemptuous of her. "This can't stand," he said flatly. "You think the town will forgive this? A young widow harboring a savage under her roof." "I gave him shelter," she answered, her voice steady though her stomach twisted. "That is all." Shelter turns to scandal, and scandal turns to ruin. His eyes cut to the house, where Nantan was hauling hay bales, his broad frame lit by the lantern glow. "Your husband would spit to see this." The words stung, sharper than any gossip. Before she could reply, Nantan stepped from the shadows, his hands still rough with hay, his gaze fixed on Boone. He did not raise his voice. He did not posture. He only stood there, silent, immovable. Boone shifted under that gaze, his confidence faltering like a boy caught in a lie. With a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and vanished into the snow. Chenoa rounded on Nantan once Boone was gone. "You should not interfere," she said, though the anger in her voice came more from herself than him. "They'll never stop if you keep standing in their way." He met her eyes, calm as stone. "If they mean harm, I will stand." The simplicity of it disarmed her. She wanted to argue, to shout, but the words would not come. She turned away instead, clutching her shawl tight, though her hands trembled not from cold, but from the recognition that his presence shielded her in a way no words ever could. The nights grew longer. Storms pressed against the house, howling through the shutters. Chenoa found herself lingering by the fire after supper, her eyes following his movements as he tended the flames or mended tools with steady patience. He seldom spoke, yet in his silence she heard a language clearer than speech. The scrape of steel on wood, the crackle of fire, the rhythm of his breathing. It filled the hollow places inside her where loneliness had lived unchecked. One evening she broke the silence. "Why do you work so hard? I have not paid you." He looked up from the harness he was repairing, his fingers scarred yet gentle on the leather. "A house without work is a grave," he said simply. Then he bent back to the task, as if no more needed saying. She carried those words with her through the days that followed. A house without work is a grave. And had she not been living in one, built of her husband's memory, sealed by the town's scorn? Each board he mended, each fire he stoked, seemed less a service to her than an act of resurrection, breathing life into a place she had abandoned to sorrow. Yet fear lingered. The more she saw his quiet strength, the more she dreaded what it meant. To need him was to risk ruin. To let him stay was to accept exile from a world that already rejected her. At night she lay awake, torn between pride and longing, shame and the small, dangerous comfort of his presence. One morning, the storm broke long enough for light to pour across the snow. Chenoa stepped outside, her boots crunching against the crusted ice. Nantan was at the fence line, hammering new boards where the wind had torn them loose. She approached, the cold biting at her cheeks. "You've done enough," she said. "You don't have to keep." Her words faltered. He straightened, the hammer resting loosely in his hand, his white hair gleaming under the pale sun. For a moment she saw not an old man but something elemental, enduring, unyielding, carved from the same earth that bore the mountains. "I said one night," she whispered. He regarded her with that steady gaze, neither pleading nor defiant. "You did." The silence stretched between them, heavy with all she could not say. Her heart pounded, caught between the memory of laughter in church and the sight of him standing in the snow, his work shaping the ranch into something more alive than it had been in years. She turned quickly, retreating toward the house before her resolve cracked. But as she reached the door, she glanced back. He was still there, hammer raised, steady as ever, as if her words had not touched him at all. Yet she knew they had. She felt it in the air, in the weight of his silence, in the way he kept building despite knowing she wished to send him away. That night, as the wind rose again, she found the mended shawl folded once more by the fire, its seams stitched tighter, stronger. She lifted it in trembling hands, her eyes stinging. And in that moment she realized the truth that frightened her most. He was not leaving. The blizzard came without warning. One moment the air was brittle with stillness, the next it roared like a beast set loose across the plains. Snow swept in sheets, erasing horizon and sky, battering the ranch house until it shuddered against the weight. Chenoa stood at the window, shawl clutched to her throat, watching the world vanish into white. The sound pressed against her chest, a howl so vast it felt as if it could strip the breath from her body. Nantan had seen the signs hours earlier. He had tethered the horses, boarded loose shutters, and stacked firewood higher than the window ledges. Now he moved with deliberate calm, carrying buckets of water inside, laying blankets near the hearth, his bare chest glistening with melted snow. Chenoa wanted to tell him to rest, but the words died. His presence was the only thing holding back the terror that gnawed at her ribs. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed them whole. Wind shrieked through every crack, rattling beams and flinging icy darts through loose boards. The fire struggled, its flames hunched low as if cowering. Chenoa wrapped herself in quilts but could not stop shivering. Her breath came shallow, her head light. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. Nantan was at her side instantly, his hands steady beneath her arms, lowering her gently into a chair. He touched her brow, his palm rough and warm against her chilled skin. She caught fragments of words in his tongue, low and rhythmic, as though he were speaking to the storm itself. Then he set about tending her, heating stones near the fire and tucking them at her feet, ladling broth into her lips, wiping the sweat that chilled her face. "You shouldn't," she whispered, ashamed of her weakness, ashamed of needing him. "I can manage." His eyes met hers, dark and steady. "You do not have to." The simplicity undid her. Tears pricked her eyes, though she turned her face away, unwilling to let him see how the walls of pride she'd built were crumbling. Outside, the storm wailed like a chorus of ghosts, and inside she felt her own ghosts pressing close. The laughter in church, Boone's condemnation, the sting of every whisper. She had fought them with silence, with distance, with a house too large for one woman to fill. But here was this man, shirtless and scarred, sitting by her side as though she were worth guarding against the whole world. Hours blurred into one another. The storm did not ease. At times the wind slammed against the door so hard she thought it would break. At others it whistled low, a mournful sound like breath across a grave. Nantan kept the fire alive, feeding it as though feeding her life itself. She drifted in and out of restless dreams, and in one she heard him again, speaking in that low tongue, not to her but for her. When she woke, she found him sitting near, his eyes half closed, as if he had been keeping vigil. By the second night, desperation drove intruders to her gate. Lanterns flickered through the storm, shadows moving toward the ranch. She heard shouts, Sheriff Cutter's voice, Boone's too, muffled but harsh, demanding the door be opened. Her heart leapt with fear. Cutter's authority, the town's judgment, had found her even here, at the storm's edge. Nantan rose without hesitation. He opened the door a crack, snow slashing into the house, and stepped out bare-chested into the fury. Chenoa rushed to the window, watching in terror as the men approached. Cutter shouted, his words ripped apart by wind. "You bring shame on this town. Send him out, widow, or we'll drag him." Boone's face twisted with triumph, his hand clutching a rifle he dared not fire in the storm. Nantan did not shout back. He simply stood, shoulders squared, white hair whipping wild in the gale. The storm seemed to gather around him, his figure unmoving while the others flinched beneath its power. Cutter advanced 2 steps, but the snow blinded him, forced him to raise his arm against the sting. Boone cursed, slipping in the drifts. Against their rage, Nantan's silence was more terrible than any threat. Chenoa pressed a hand to the glass, breath trembling. She thought he would fight, that blood would soak into snow, that this would end in violence. But after a moment Cutter barked something harsh, gestured to Boone, and the men retreated, their lanterns swallowed by the storm. Nantan lingered in the snow, staring after them, before turning back to the house. When he stepped inside, ice clinging to his hair, Chenoa could not speak. Her throat closed on words of gratitude, of fear, of shame. He laid another log on the fire, as if nothing had happened, and sat once more by her side. She stared at him through blurred vision, her heart heavy with a realization she had fought for weeks. The world might despise her for this man's presence, but without him she would not survive. She leaned back, exhausted, and whispered into the hush between them. "They'll never forgive me now." He looked at her, the fire casting shadows across the planes of his face. "Forgive yourself first." The words struck deep, like an arrow finding its mark. She turned away, unable to bear the weight of them, yet unable to forget them. All her life since widowhood, she had lived as if her worth were measured by others' eyes. Now here was this man, marked by age, by scars, by the cruelty of a land that took more than it gave, telling her that her dignity was hers to claim. The storm raged for 2 more days. They endured it together, his strength steady, her resistance eroding until only raw truth remained. When at last the wind began to weaken, silence fell heavy over the snowbound ranch. Chenoa sat by the fire, shawl around her shoulders, her body weak but her heart restless. She watched Nantan move, his hands mending a tool, his breath calm as though storms were nothing new. Something shifted inside her then. It was not surrender, nor yet acceptance, but a recognition that he had crossed a threshold. No longer a stranger seeking shelter, he was the one who had stood in the storm when others came to break her. That night, she dreamed of standing in church again, the crowd's whispers hissing like snakes. But when she turned, it was not loneliness at her side. It was him, steady and silent, and the sound of axes splitting would rang louder than the voices of scorn. She woke with tears on her cheeks, the fire glowing low, and realized with a pang of fear and longing that she no longer wanted him gone. Spring had not yet come, but the storm finally broke. The air was still sharp with frost, the snow piled high against the fences, yet a brightness lingered in the sky that hinted at thaw. Chenoa stood at the window, watching the light fall across the drifts, her heart uneasy despite the calm. For weeks she had lived between 2 worlds, the warmth of Nantan's presence and the cold bite of the town's scorn, and she knew the day of reckoning would come. It arrived with the creak of wagon wheels, and the murmur of voices carried on the brittle wind. A crowd gathered at the end of the lane, lanterns swaying, eyes glittering with judgment. Sheriff Cutter rode at the front, Delilah Crow clutching her shawl beside him, and behind them trailed Boone and others whose whispers had long sharpened into knives. Chenoa's stomach turned. They had not come for words this time. Nantan stood in the yard, bare-chested as ever, his white hair flowing against the pale sky. He faced the crowd without flinching, his hands resting loose at his sides. Cutter dismounted, boots crunching on snow, his jaw set. "Enough of this shame," he said, his voice ringing like iron. "Widow Greyhawk, send him away, or the town will cast you out. We won't abide this mockery any longer." The words cut through the cold air, and murmurs rose in their wake. Chenoa felt every eye press against her, demanding surrender. For a heartbeat she wavered, shame coiling like a snake in her chest. She saw herself as they saw her, young, foolish, clinging to a man old enough to be her father and worse, a man they called savage. But then her gaze fell on Nantan. He did not move, did not plead, only stood with the same unshaken stillness that had carried her through every storm. Her hand trembled against the window. "Dignity is not given. It is claimed." His words echoed like a bell within her. Slowly, with breath caught in her throat, she opened the door and stepped into the snow. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she walked forward, shawl wrapped close, her face pale but her chin lifted. She stopped at Nantan's side and slipped her hand into his. His skin was rough, warm, steady. The world seemed to hush. "He is no shame to me," she said, her voice clear though her heart thundered. "He is the only honor I have known." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Cutter's jaw tightened, Boone's fists clenched, and Delilah's lips curved in bitter disbelief. Whispers surged like wind through tall grass. Some looked away, faces flushed with discomfort. Others stared, hungry for spectacle. Cutter stepped closer, anger sharp in his eyes. "You would defy the law of the church, your own husband's memory for him?" His hand hovered near his pistol, the threat unspoken but heavy in the air. Before Chenoa could answer, Boone lunged forward, spitting curses, his hand reaching for her arm. In an instant, Nantan moved. His hand closed around Boone's wrist, not cruelly, but with such force that the younger man froze, his face twisting in pain. The crowd gasped. For a heartbeat violence teetered on the edge, the snow bright and still beneath the tension. "Let him go!" Cutter barked, drawing his gun halfway from its holster. Nantan released Boone, who stumbled back, clutching his arm. But the old Apache did not retreat. He stepped forward instead, his body casting a shadow across the snow, his white hair bright as fire in the pale light. He looked at Cutter, then at the crowd, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. "You have mocked her. You have hunted me. But I do not fear you. And she will not bow to you." The words, so few, so steady, cracked the air open. The crowd wavered. Some shifted uneasily, others muttered, but no one advanced. Cutter's hand lingered on his gun, yet something in Nanton's stillness made the threat hollow. He was not a man they could drag away like a thief. He was a mountain standing against their storm. Chenoa felt her breath break, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel alone beneath the weight of their judgment. She tightened her grip on Nanton's hand, raised her chin higher, and turned to the crowd. "I am not cursed. I am not your shame. I am a woman, and I choose who stands beside me. If you cannot bear it, turn away." The declaration rang through the cold like a bell tolling across the valley. Silence followed, stretching long, until at last one by one the townsfolk looked away. Some turned their wagons, some muttered under their breath, and slowly, like snow melting under sun, the gathering dissolved. Cutter's glare lingered, but he holstered his gun. "You'll regret this," he said low, before turning his horse and riding off. When the last of the lanterns vanished, the yard was quiet again, the snow gleaming under faint moonlight. Chenoa let out a breath she had not known she was holding, her whole body trembling. Nanton's hand remained in hers, steady as the earth. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears that felt both fierce and freeing. "They will never forgive us," she whispered. His eyes, dark and unwavering, met hers. "We do not need their forgiveness." The truth of it struck her deeper than any sermon. For so long she had lived shackled by others' voices, crushed beneath their scorn. But standing there in the snow, hand in hand with the man who had weathered every storm at her side, she felt a strength that was hers alone. They walked back toward the house together, their footsteps pressing deep into the drifts. The ranch loomed ahead, no longer a mausoleum, but a home forged in defiance. The firelight glowed in the windows, steady, waiting. As they crossed the threshold, Chenoa glanced once more at the empty lane, knowing whispers would continue, that judgment would never truly vanish. But for the first time, she did not care. She had chosen. She had claimed her dignity in the sight of all. And yet, as the door closed behind them, her heart thudded with the dangerous certainty of what she had begun. The battle was not over. It was only beginning.